From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Judges everywhere. And after a year of the Senate doing almost nothing other than confirming judges, Joe Biden looks poised to beat Donald Trump's first-term record for federal judicial appointments. That as the Senate and the White House maneuver to make it harder for Donald Trump to appoint more. Welcome to Potomac Watch, and with me today to talk about all things judgy are two court experts, Colin Levy and Bill McGurn. Welcome to you both. Barring any last hiccups, the Senate looks poised this week to confirm Biden's 235th judicial pick, which would put him one judge ahead of Trump's record of 234. This has been an almost manic obsession of Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's, who essentially ignored all other Senate business of the past year to get this done. And just ask any member of the Senate, many of whom are steamed that they didn't get votes on anything else that they wanted to have done. But Colin, as someone who has watched the courts for a long time, numbers do matter. The press is also very focused on the diversity question, and Biden does leave having appointed record numbers of judges from different categories, women, minority judges. But also what matters is influence. And when we look out there broadly at Biden's impact on the courts that really matter, in particular the Supreme Court and circuit courts, appeals courts, what do you think his legacy is going to be?
These are big numbers. You know, they, as you say, they surpass what Donald Trump managed to do. And that's just a lot of lifetime appointees. And of course, some of those are going to go on to be appointed to circuit courts in the future as well. So his administration has made a real priority of adding diversity to the bench. He obviously changed the courts in that regard. Ketanji Brown Jackson, obviously the first African-American woman on the Supreme Court. And about 60% of his judicial appointees are people of color. So that's a big legacy. But I think in other ways, he really didn't have as much of an impact as Donald Trump did when he was in office. The nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson didn't change the ideological balance of the court because, you know, she replaced Stephen Breyer. And Trump, on the other hand, had 3 Supreme Court nominees and got to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg with Amy Coney Barrett. So that shifted the court ideological balance to 6-3 in favor of the conservatives, which has been obviously significant over the past 5 years. So I think as we drill down and get a little bit more granular on the subject, so many of the major decisions that come out of the circuit courts are the ones that we really are looking for because they, you know, those decisions never actually make it up to the Supreme Court. And in that category, Trump also came out ahead. You know, he flipped the ideological balance of the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 11th circuits when he was president. He also appointed 10 judges to the enormous 9th Circuit Court of Appeals, which brought that court system, which usually leans pretty left, a bit more back into balance. You know, Biden flipped the 2nd Circuit back to more progressive control, but that was about it. But the biggest thing here is that I really think what matters is what these judges do and what they say when they're on the bench. And as we look at this, you know, vast body of accumulating precedent, the intellectual rigor and the legal horsepower that comes from the judges across the ideological spectrum really matters. The powerful opinions that are tightly reasoned are the ones that end up guiding the thinking, not just of the lower court judges, but also, you know, judges down through time. So, you know, the citation matters, the writing matters. And in that category, I do think it's notable that the Trump nominees are rising in the category of those considered to be, you know, good legal thinkers.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch over the coming years is of these 235 picks who are out there, what becomes their record of influencing the Supreme Court or, by contrast, being overturned by circuit courts or by the Supreme Court. Bill, a lot of people are going to be focused on these diversity numbers, on the ideology question, on the influence question, just the pure numbers. But I think one other thing has to be mentioned here if we're really going to talk about Biden's judicial legacy. And it's not even about the judges, but it's about his approach to the judiciary and some of the damage that I would argue was done under his administration by his decision to join with those that have tried to suggest that the Supreme Court in particular is corrupt and needs to be dramatically changed. I mean, Donald Trump, let's be clear, he was certainly mouthy about judges and the courts, although he was often because he was grumpy about this or that decision that came out. But I think this is different in that, you know, Joe Biden has at moments exhibited open hostility to the Supreme Court, in particular in the wake of the Dobbs decision. He also rebuked it for its presidential immunity decision. which is kind of weird, by the way, because he's president, and that case actually helps all presidents in the future. But he did it in not necessarily criticizing the actual opinions themselves, their legal reasoning, but suggesting that the court had some ill intent in putting these out. And of course, this summer, before he got out of the race, he bowed to his progressive wing and ended up endorsing this sweeping plan to remake the Supreme Court and slap it with a sweeping new ethics code, because Democrats are desperate to exert control over it. So as we look at the court and unfortunately some of its falling approval ratings, what's going to be Biden's legacy there?
You're right. One area you forgot is student loans, where President Biden is just defying the Supreme Court. Remind me again, who is the candidate or the president that is breaking Democratic norms? Joe Biden or Donald Trump? Joe Biden is very outcome oriented. And he tipped off his hand when he announced, I think it was in the campaign, but before his first appointment, that he was going to appoint a Black woman to the Supreme Court. That, in effect, already diminished her because it suggested that she was not picked on merit, but on her skin color. And so I think that does enormous harm to the candidates who are picked. And I think Jackson didn't help herself much in the hearings when she couldn't even define a woman. I think the Biden legacy is going to be very mixed. He seems to do everything for the political gain that he needs at the moment. The Supreme Court was just a tool in his hands to do this. And I think they're going to pay for that because, as you and Colin were suggesting, I think the intellectual firepower of the people he picked was really not that great, hasn't made a mark. And I think the Trump picks have a much clearer idea of the law, the Constitution, and are much more respected in terms of their judicial output.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, more on Biden and his judicial record. Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel. I'm here with Bill McGurn and Colin Levy. Bill, you bring up a great point about the student loans and this president and a number of the orders and mandates he put out, rules that seem to thumb a nose at the judiciary in a way. But it touches on another subject, which just I think is another unfortunate turn of events that's put the Supreme Court in a very awkward position. And Colin, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. But in addition to requiring at times to actually step up and simply say, sorry, you don't have the legal authority to do this, because this is what courts exist to do. I would argue Biden's been more brazen in that, in ignoring some of its prior decisions, especially on student loans. But what we've also had over the past 4, 6, 7 years are some of these other broken precedents and standards that have led to things like lawfare, our special counsel Jack Smith in the cases that were brought against Donald Trump, all of which has forced the Supreme Court to end up stepping into some of these really ugly political disputes that end up making it take a side. And it kind of has no choice. I mean, one good example I would give was when it had to step in over that Colorado decision, Supreme Court, which essentially, said that Trump could be stripped off the ballot because he was an insurrectionist. They had to step in and do something, but it does put them in this unenviable position of then choosing a legal decision and then getting tarred for it as stepping into politics when it really wasn't their decision. What's going to be the legacy of that? Can we expect anything to get better? And how bad has that been for the court's reputation?
I think it's been horrible for the court's reputation, to be honest, Kim. I think people on really all sides of the political spectrum just don't want judges directly involved in politics. We all say we don't want it and then keeps happening and then we all complain about it. But judges wear black robes for a reason. It's supposed to be a symbol of them being in some ways above this political melee. And I see what's happening now in terms of the way the Supreme Court has gotten involved with entangled in certain things that they might not have wanted to do. Depressing. I also find it especially depressing, the story that we saw this week with the phenomenon of some of the federal judges who decided to back out of their retirements because Donald Trump is going to be appointing for the next round of vacancies on the benches. I feel like we've progressed, from this era in which judicial nominations were routinely confirmed on a bipartisan basis into this hyper polarized environment where we're actually seeing the judges trying to affect the ideological leanings of the courts. So, when you see things like what happened this week, where judges are actually going back on their words, in order to advantage one political party over another, I think it just really weakens people's confidence that the courts can ever be even-handed. And, to give a little bit more granularity here, as you know, Kim, what happened most recently was that this Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals Judge Wynn had originally planned to take senior status, and President Biden had nominated North Carolina Solicitor General Ryan Park to fill that seat. But when it became clear that Mr. Park was not going to get confirmed, Judge Wynn backed out of the retirement, wrote a letter to President Biden saying, that he decided after careful consideration to continue in his regular active service. And that's a problem because in November, Senate Republicans cut this deal with Majority Leader Chuck Schumer in which they agreed to stop any procedural delays on Biden's district court nominations. And in return, the Democrats agreed to leave those 4 pending circuit court vacancies open. So the judge single-handedly inserted himself into this political deal making, which I think it's really toxic change.
Yeah. So just to be clear too, Colin, to clarify for listeners, this phenomenon of judges unretiring. I mean, we all understand judges make decisions often about their retirement based on presidential politics, who might make their replacements, that's fine. But to say you are going to take senior status and then wait until an election is over and then change your mind, that's different, right?
For sure. Yeah, it's a completely different thing because these were retirements that were announced, most of them back in January. And it was only just now, as Donald Trump's about to take office, that those changes were reneged.
But Bill, this is really quite remarkable because it seems to be part and parcel of a broader effort right now, not just for Democrats to get as many Biden nominees confirmed as possible, but to do all they can to ensure Trump doesn't get to fill spots. And I think the Senate piece of this is really important because this deal was made and there were these 4 circuit court nominees. They didn't likely have the votes to get through anyway. Chuck Schumer at a certain point made that call. One of his spokespeople actually bragged afterward about the deal that they made with Senate Republicans about the other nominations. He said the trade was 4 circuit nominees, all lacking the votes to get confirmed for more than triple the number of additional judges moving forward. So a big brag there about the deal they'd made on judges. And then you have this judge come out and change his mind, and that reduces those 4 open slots for Donald Trump to fill to 3. And Republicans, by the way, have held up their end of the bargain. And while Colin was just talking about the unflattering look for judges who are unretiring, I think this is very bad for the Senate, too, because breaking Senate deals is not a pretty thing. And I guess you can say, well, this was a judge's decisions, but Republicans aren't going to look at that. They're going to look at this as a sort of plot between Democrats and left-leaning judges. And I don't think that that's really good for future nominations either.
No, it's horrible. Colin is exactly right about the political motivations. And, the Senate is based on deals like this. You get something, you give something. No one gets 100%. And the oil of those deals is trust. And when you can't trust the other side to keep its word, you don't want to make deals with them. And that's so much of the problems. When they talk about Democratic norms, whether it's a filibuster, a lot of it is not based on the law itself, what the law allows. It's based on what tradition, what the practice has been, and the faith in that, and that there are good reasons on both sides to adhere to a tradition, even if at the moment it works against you. And when you break that trust, Washington and the Senate become far more polarized, far more difficult place to get things done, and far more bitter and antagonistic. So again, it seems to me this is a pattern of short-sighted Democratic politicking for something that may come back to them, come back and haunt them later.